Hi guys, so this is our group project for Comm 52. Our topic is transmisogyny.
First, we wanted to talk about some key terms before we even get to what it is. And the first one is transphobia, and it's discrimination and hatred against trans people. The second is misogyny, and it's hatred of or prejudice against women and feminine characteristics. So now we want to talk about the history of transmisogyny. The definition of that word is the combination of transphobia and misogyny that trans women face every day. The first time we even heard that word was with trans feminist activist Julia Serrano in 2007. She explained that the traditional sexism is that the belief of maleness and masculinity are superior to femaleness and femininity. And oppositional sexism is that belief that female and male are rigid, mutually exclusive categories.
Moving on to the violence of transmisogyny, while the data for violence against transgender people is very scarce, the majority of hate crimes against trans people are targeted to trans women. Over half of all anti-LGBTQ homicides were perpetrated against transgender women, and many of these victims were trans women of color. Violence is also seen in the state as well. Many trans women of color are stereotyped as highly sexual and criminal and targeted for doing sex work even if they have no association with it. Trans women are also very vulnerable when arrested because they're forced to stay in men's prisons in which they experience mistreatment and sexual assault. Moving on to the next slide.
So now I'm going to overview some of the statistics that partially break down the experiences of transgender folks living in the United States. Of course, these statistics don't cover the full experience, just offer some insight. So currently, about 1.4 million transgender people live in the United States. Transgender folks are 4 times more likely to live in poverty. They experience unemployment at twice the rate of the general population, with transgender people of color experience the highest rates of unemployment. 90% of transgender folks report experiences of harassment, mistreatment, and discrimination while at work. 41% of transgender folks have reported an attempt at suicide, compared to 1.6% of the general population. Going to the next slide, why does transmisogyny exist? Transmisogyny assumes that femininity is inferior to masculinity. Basically, qualities or characteristics associated with femaleness are considered less than qualities of maleness, and therefore these feminine characteristics are then deemed deserving of hatred, mockery, and violence. Trans women tend to experience a different kind of marginalization due to the fact that they're both trans and feminine, and they are marginalized on both accounts. As stated by the Battered Women's Support Services Organization, transmisogyny reflects a hatred of those who do not fit easily into either side of the gender binary. Ultimately, this means that those who challenge the social understanding of gender, which is largely transgender people, that means they often face extreme oppression and marginalization.
One of the most prominent forms of transmisogyny that exists today is through what is known as the TERF movement. Now, you may have heard this referred to as gender critical, but the acronym TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And this first emerged during the second wave of feminism in the 1970s, when groups of radical feminists began threatening violence against trans women who were occupying women-only spaces during different activism events. This group would go on throughout the decades to not only protest against trans women inclusion in any women's rights, but for health insurance companies to drop coverage of any transition-related care as well. The ideology behind this group asserts that a trans woman's gender identity is not legitimate, and as such they should not be included in the same category as cis women and have the same rights or occupy the same public spaces. While this movement hasn't gained much traction in the United States, it has taken a much deeper root in the United Kingdom, where TERF ideology is becoming the core of the modern feminist movement, with support from both media outlets and celebrity voices alike. For instance, in 2018, the Times UK published an article utilizing TERF propaganda that painted trans women as deviants and dangerous to cis women. Additionally, as some of you may recall last year, the Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling came under fire for her tweets parroting gender-critical rhetoric that transgender women are impeding on the lived reality of cis women and all of the rights they fought for. These are just a few recent examples of the growing number of cases of the TERF movement that is slowly working towards justifying these discriminatory acts towards trans women and are indicative of a growing social issue. Next, Georgia will be talking about harmful language and how that affects trans women.
So harmful language against trans women has been manifested in media portrayals and the slurs and terms we use to marginalize the specific group of people. Specifically with the hypersexualization of trans women in the media, It's a huge contributor to stereotyping or the way our society tends to view trans women as unattractive or even manipulative. Using slurs and terms that demonize or devalue trans women also contribute to the marginalization of this group, while also erasing their own stories and identities. By not respecting preferred names and pronouns, we also further the erasure of trans women's identities in our society. It's important to understand how these tropes are used in media and how our historic use of demeaning language limits room for inclusivity and intensifies both transphobic and misogynistic behavior.
And this is our reference page. Thank you so much for hearing us and learning about our topic. Hope you like it.